So, once upon a time, I tried to make a history-related YouTube channel before Primus Academy. This channel was called the Inquisitive Historian, with the only video on the channel uploaded on May 7th, 2017. That video was about historiography. Now, I've been working on a longer video about the Battle of Fallujah, but to put some content out during this temporary lull in content, I'm going to put out that video over here. So without further ado, here's my old Inquisitive Historian video about historiography. I hope you enjoy. Greetings everyone, and welcome to the Inquisitive Historian. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm a university student majoring in history and education, and I have a strong love of history. I decided to create this channel to share some of my findings and things I've been studying to anyone who might be interested. However, to get into the subject of history, I think that it's important to look into the history of the study of history, that is, the history of historiography. Historiography is, fundamentally, the way history is studied. Given the nature of history, it is almost impossible to uncover the ultimate truth in many scenarios of history. In order to find out what might be the closest conclusion to the truth, there are different philosophies regarding historiography, with different points of view over how history should be studied and especially how history should be interpreted. Interpretations of history usually involve the weighing of cause and effects, as well as correlations and lessons learned from history to apply to the modern world. Some ideas that come into play with historiographical philosophies are ideas like historicism and historical agents, and methods of studying history can include microhistory and great man history. Historicism is the idea that, in order to fully understand an event or time in history, we must understand the context and the way of thought by the people of the time. We cannot bring values and beliefs of our modern world and retroactively apply them to the past, simply because it was an entirely different world, according to historicism. Historical agents are elements that consistently drive history, such as the need for resources or progressive ideas pushed by social movements. Some methods of organizing and studying history include ideas like microhistory, a method of study that focuses on the most microcosmic subjects, like the history of wooden chairs in 18th century Poland. Great man history is a method of organizing history in a way that focuses on individuals that supposedly serve as one of the driving points for historical events and changes. Before modernization and professionalization of history, there were different schools of historiographic thought. In ancient times, even into the Common Era, history was usually recorded in the forms of epics and myths, usually depicting a very fantastic turn of events. Similarly, religion often played a role in these early histories. This notion would expand onwards, particularly around the early 13th century in Europe, where we see Christian histories develop. Because of the dominance of Christianity at the time, it is often members of the clergy who wrote history from the perspective of good versus evil and of God versus the devil. Other early historical philosophies include cyclical and cultural histories. Cyclical history presented history as a cycle, repeating common themes. For example, a cyclical historian might look at history as a cycle of golden ages and dark ages. Cultural histories were histories developed to provide a full context within a society at a given time. Jakob Burckhardt's The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy is one of the more notable examples of a cultural history, published in 1860. All of these forms of study was before the professionalization of history and the development of the foundations of how we study history today. As a result, many of these pre-professional histories on their own are troublesomely flawed. However, it was the Greek historian Herodotus who brought a sort of methodology to the table when it came to composing history, and would become key in modern historiography even if it was a methodology lost soon after his time. While composing a history of events like the Persian Wars, Herodotus would interview both Greeks and Persians and present his findings from his studies in his works, developing an early, if not the first, modern use of perspectives in history. During the Enlightenment, many scholars began to rethink the way they studied their field. Empiricism became one of the leading schools of thought, empiricism being the idea that observable evidence is key in understanding phenomena. German historian Leopold von Ranke took this idea of empiricism and applied it to the study of history towards the end of the innovative period of the Enlightenment. Ranke conducted his study of history by thoroughly using sources, including sources that would be classified as primary sources and secondary sources. Von Ranke used what could be called the historical method by looking at numerous sources and corroborating them, that is, seeing what the sources had in common. In order to do this, von Ranke sourced material, thinking about where the source came from, like its author and location, when it was made, and what purpose the source was written for. It was through sourcing that von Ranke could try to pinpoint any biases the sources had. After sourcing and corroborating different sources, von Ranke would synthesize his findings into his conclusion in works. This historical method would become the very foundations of studying history that we use today. With the use of the historical method, the study of history became more recognized as a science and profession rather than an art as it was considered previously. Von Ranke's main rival was George Hegel, who based much of his thought on the foundations of historicism, the idea that the past is another world that we cannot apply modern beliefs to in regarding our interpretations. Hegel also believed that history was in a sort of path of progress in the improvement of freedom. Hegel is closely tied to the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis theory, which held the following thought. In one status quo, the thesis, there will always be issues that the people will rise to counteract, an antithesis. However, in the end, it will be the best parts from both the thesis and the antithesis that will win out, and a synthesis will be created as the new status quo. That synthesis is then the new thesis, and the process carries on and on. Out of the post-Ranke world, many new historical philosophies formed. In the 20th century, French historians developed what would be known as the Annales School, a school of thought on history that held beliefs along the lines that historians needed a total context in order to understand history, in the sense that one needed to understand the social context, regional context, cultural context, and so on. This school of thought became dominant in Europe at the time. Out of Hegel's idealism, Marxist historiography developed. Marxist history looked at the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis school of thought, especially, and explained that a global communist society was the ultimate synthesis and where history would inevitably come to. In the United States, progressive history was popular with significant historians like Charles Beard leading the movement. Progressive history saw history as a sort of class conflict between upper classes and the working classes, and that class was the historical agent or driving force of history. Progressive history took a very anti-business stance. Progressive historians also had a strong sense of rhetoric and cynicism in their work. During the Cold War, the United States was facing its opponent, the Soviet Union. As part of efforts to unite the people of the United States against the likes of communism, consensus history was developed to create a near-propaganda view of the past. In the United States particularly, consensus historians presented the past as a uniform golden age that people in the present must look back to. Some consensus historians present things like the American War of Independence as a war that all Americans were united in. A consensus historian today would look at the 1950s as an example of a time period of strong, respectable values, and simply a brighter, more unified time, while, in contrast, a progressive historian or New Left historian would look at the 1950s and look down upon it as a time of racial segregation and the enforcement of traditional values through suppressing new trends. Consensus history also formed out of the rejection of progressive history's anti-business philosophy. As the 1960s came around, more and more anti-consensus history schools of thought arose in the form of New Left history. As the Soviet Union became more and more disagreeable to many Marxist historians instead transitioned to schools of thought like progressive history, but also using their own influences to create this New Left history. New Left history took a much more social approach to history, developing historical methodologies in the form of race history, gender and women's history, as well as the history of social movements. The historical method is the most important key to studying history. Leaving one's biases at the door in order to identify the biases of others, in order to try to find the closest reality to the truth, is a difficult process that many cannot do well enough to properly study history. For some, finding their historical philosophy is difficult as well, especially given the strengths and weaknesses each philosophy holds. In order to develop ourselves as historians, it is important to keep doing research and to strive to be the best historians that we can be.